What mysteries are concealed beneath Black Hollow Plantation's soil? 7 youngsters simply disappeared. Were they indeed buried in plain sight or lost? Who was the young lady who made silence become a kind of revenge, establishing a legacy that would linger in the land for many generations? Was it possible for the earth to recall what the living decided to forget? Froterista sombra. Beneath the charred earth of southern silence hangs over Georgia like the weight of time. As laborers got ready to clear the last traces of the once dreaded Black Hollow Plantation in the spring of 1923, they discovered something the earth had made an effort to forget. With its white columns now reduced to bone-white ghosts among the ivy, the house had long since fallen victim to disease and vine. But a hollow cavern withstood the grave beneath the rubble, beyond the cellar's crumbling stone. Initially, it was only a narrow, only 4 feet high and only broad enough for a man to crawl through. The hole was chiseled out of the clay. The air was metallic and sluggish, heavy with centuries. By chance, they discovered the tunnel in the basement behind a fallen wine rack. Bricks had been used to seal it from the inside. Lanterns were called for by the men, but light refused to stay. Deep scratches that resembled clawing ran along the tunnel walls. Before it opened into a chamber that was square, moist, and unnervingly exact in its dimensions, the path bent downhill for a few yards. 7 tiny depressions in the ground, now submerged and covered with roots and fungi, were located at its center. These were beds of silence rather than actual graves. The dirt had long since taken what was buried there. However, above each hollow, a symbol, a single human hand engraved in profile with the index finger pointing downward, was shabbily carved into the wall using a sharp tool. Just the stone, no dates, no names, the eerie arrangement, and the silence. The discovery was never reported in the papers. The landowners, a peaceful Savannah banking family, gave the order to level the remains and reseal the tunnel. To forget, the workers received good pay. However, one of them, Elijah Barrett, kept a journal. In that journal, he also detailed the stories that the local elders muttered, in addition to the uneasiness of the tunnel. The Black families, with their long memories and longer silences, whispered stories to each other. They mentioned a woman named Elsie, whose name had not been listed in any census, church burial record, or plantation ledger. However, the name was persistent and incomprehensible, moving through oral history like smoke. A woman who observed, who waited, who disappeared, who listened more than she talked. Elijah's journal comes to a sudden conclusion. Only a sketch appears on its final page months after the discovery. Beneath a roofless house are 7 little mounds. And beneath that, even when the living do not remember, the soil does, in crooked handwriting. The past had simply been misplaced, not buried. Now a question rose with the dust as the dirt agitated once again. Who were they? Who or what had made the decision to lay the 7 down in the dark? The Black Hollow Plantation, with its cotton fields, loomed like a scar across the Georgia lowlands in 1858. Like a terrible sea, it stretches out in all directions. With its broad verandas and rusting iron fittings, the huge mansion, whitewashed and intimidating, sat at its center. Bleeding hands had created the home, and those hands continued to roam through its halls, unidentified and invisible. When Elsie was taken to Black Hollow, she was 15 years old. Unlike others who arrived, she did not scream. She remained silent out of coiled tension rather than fear. She kept an eye on everything, from the flicker in the overseer's forehead to the jingling pattern of keys on his belt. She paid attention to what was avoided rather than what was stated. In the house slaves' windowless chambers at night, she used burning twigs and bone to etch shards of memory onto discarded fabric. She could only vaguely recall her mother's face, the smell of soap root, and a low-pitched tune that was nearly inaudible. Her mother was sold to another plantation and disappeared during transit. Even worse, nobody ever informed her. No one asked questions in Black Hollow. The whip was sufficient punishment. Elsie was put in charge of the kitchen under the supervision of the cook, Miss Grafton, a thin woman whose voice was constantly tinged with disdain. But Elsie picked it up fast. Because she was small and frequently forgotten, she kept her head down and moved quietly, so she heard things she shouldn't have, like the disagreements between Reverend Crane, Master Abner Calloway's brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law, a man whose sermons had a brandy odor. or the abrupt silences that occurred when specific names were mentioned among the older hands. Children who used to run barefoot through the quarters but were now just not there. 7 names that were only partially spoken: Jonah, Ruthie, Matthew, Anth, Jonah, Sila, and Sam. The past tense was not used when discussing them. They were just avoided, as though calling them names might bring back memories of the dark. Elsie recalled all of them. The precise dates were inscribed like holy scars into her fabric journal, and she recalled their faces, some more vividly than others, as well as the mornings they were last seen. She started to see the trend. Every vanishing took place at a new moon. Each came after Reverend Crane's visit. Every youngster has been classified as simple, defiant, or problematic, and none had ever come back. Old Moses was once questioned by Elsie about the tunnel. She had heard one of the white men mention something under the home, but she wasn't entirely sure what she was asking. After staring at her for a while, Moses, who had hardly been able to walk after surviving 3 masters, whispered, "That ain't a place the Lord ever stepped foot in." She didn't ask again. But Elsie discovered a loose one the following day near the pantry, beneath the floorboards. Plank, a hollow, dust, splinters, and a piece of fabric too small for an adult man were beneath it. It had a richer, almost coppery scent to it, along with moist dirt. Without a word, she swapped out the plank. Elsie didn't sleep that night. She heard the house breathing. As though weighed down by something it had long since ingested, it shuffled and moaned. And she comprehended in a manner that she was unable to but clarify that there were no spirits in the house. The recollection haunted it. And even after being buried, remembrance endures. It waits. The smell of clay and rain filled the night. The wind had risen across the fields, bending the cotton stalks till they murmured together when Elsie first saw what no one dared to say out loud. Additionally, the lamplight in the kitchen fluctuated. Like restless souls, they pressed against the walls. Elsie, who had done this innumerable times, had been ordered to go to the basement and get more firewood. However, something felt different that evening. The air was tense, pressing against her lungs. She heard voices behind the flour and sugar stacks, not high but piercing enough to freeze her. The harsh, measured voice of Master Abner Calloway, accompanied by the quiet whisper of Reverend Crane. Her stomach grew constricted. Their steps were careful on the stone floor, and they were advancing slowly. Perhaps it was curiosity or some deeper instinct that drove her to follow in silence down the small corridor into the cellar's dark corner. Elsie caught sight of them. They were carrying a little limp creature with heavy legs and drooping arms. She knew it instantly as the face briefly glimpsed in the flicker of the lamplight. Little Ruthie had been dead in the arms of those who professed to be shepherding the faithful for the past 6 weeks. Her insides twisted at the sight. She opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Her tongue was trapped in the iron grip of fear. She had never seen the stairway before, but the men came down it. The stairway, small and rudimentary, was constructed from rough-cut lumber and concealed behind a wall of ancient barrels. It descended into a room underneath. The scent of damp stone and decay filled the cellar. With her pulse pounding so hard that she thought it may betray her, Elsie pressed herself against the wall. Marks that no hand should make were engraved inside the walls. They were almost ritualistic and purposeful. 7 shallow, rudimentary burials, organized like some horrible metaphor, were buried in the center of the clay floor. She was as clear-headed as someone who has previously saw too much injustice and realized that the 7 weren't only the victims of illness or accident. A cold, deliberate hand had placed them here on purpose. Her thoughts whirled. These individuals, dressed in sanctity and authority, had planned the killings of 7 youngsters. She swallowed the hot, furious rage that rushed through her, keeping her body motionless and her breathing calm. Should she be apprehended, the penalty would be unthinkable and quick. Nevertheless, she realized a reality too profound for words in that moment. There was no one in the quarters she could trust to step in. Of all of them, fear outweighed conscience. Elsie tried to talk to the others later, in the privacy of her own room. She muttered about the kids, the room, and the tunnel. A few gazed, their eyes wide and trembling. Others fiercely shook their heads as though reality could be erased by denial. Old Moses was the only one who sat quietly, nodding once solemnly before muttering something she would never forget. "The earth will have its say, but the earth listens, kid." Elsie's life took a drastic turn after that night. She made deliberate movements while studying, memorizing, and observing. Every door, floorboard, and hidden watercourse turned into a mental map, and a plan started to take shape in the darkest recesses of her being. It was born of justice, not of forgiveness or optimism. The plantation was a machine, and she, a tiny cog, had seen its hidden gears. She dreamed of a reckoning that would be felt long after her voice was silenced. She was quiet, patient, and persistent as she started to comprehend the cruel geometry of Black Hollow, the hidden staircase, the cellar, the graves. Elsie was learning how to rouse the ground beneath the home, which had swallowed much but not everything. After Elsie found the secret room, weeks went by. Like sediment, it builds upon itself every day. Under the sun, the fields of Black Hollow were endlessly bright and uncaring. But anxiety coiled like a serpent, poised to strike, inside the quarters. Elsie's movements were silent and precise, her eyes constantly following paths and her ears alert for even the slightest disturbance. Every mutter talk, she mentally recorded each step on the groaning floors. She disappeared one night when a storm swept across the plantation. There was no sign that she was departing. She slipped through the quarters and into the thick woods outside the property's perimeter, but no one noticed her. Days passed while the overseers looked, the White families cursing the girl's daring disappearance. They claimed she had run away. North, as though freedom were a straightforward path that might be freely traversed. The slaves had a different understanding. It started very quietly. The cruelly humorous Capitas was discovered hanging in one of the ancient barns. The rope wound neatly around his neck as though it had been put there by invisible hands. He was not found by any footprints. There was no disturbance of the ground. Next was the Reverend, who had before been so sure of divine protection. His body was stripped of the conceit he had worn like a robe when he was found in the water of a dry well. Although no one dared mention Elsie's name, panic started to spread throughout the home. The last was Master Abner Calloway, a haughty and untouchable figure in power. He did not disappear in silence. He was discovered in the same cellar where Ruthie and the other kids had been hidden. A rusted nail held a message to his chest that said, "I, the ground, listen for you." His face was fixed in fear, eyes wide, mouth agape. Although nobody knew how she had returned or what had happened in the shadows, the servants murmured that Elsie was responsible. The tunnel was resealed in the chamber beneath the house, as though it had never been disturbed. However, the 7 indentations in the clay floor persisted, and now meticulous lettering and etchings on the walls were Jonah, Sila, Matthew, Anth, Paul, Ruthie, and Sam are the children's names. It served as a warning, a memorial, and a record. The carvings were intentional and accurate. Every letter is evidence of a mind that has been planning for a long time without speaking. After then, there was an odd silence on the plantation. The air was heavier with fear than before, as though the ground itself had changed. The White family retreated into their own seclusion, and no slave dared openly discuss what had transpired. Own shadows plagued by deeds they were unable to comprehend or justify. There were rumors that Elsie's name was being carried by whispers in the wind and a person moving unseen. However, mortal eyes never saw her again. Additionally, a new form of veneration emerged in the hearts of the enslaved. Elsie had been hurt, but she had done something. Her silence had been a tactic, her patience a weapon. She had made her way through the maze of oppression and terror. Road of vengeance, one that would continue long after she was gone. In remembrance, the plantation spoke of justice that could never be enforced by a whip or lecture. Elsie was no longer just a girl. Unseen and untouchable, but indisputable, she had become a reckoning. She had suffered, and the earth had quietly retaliated against her. Many years after Black Hollow's walls had collapsed and the earth had been sold, the soil continued to hum with the events that had taken place beneath the estate. When the last of the plantation's remains were removed in the spring of 1923, a piece of cloth was discovered among the rubble. Upon close inspection, faint marks may be seen despite its small size, brittleness, and blackened edges. Writing lines scrolled with bone or charred twig. It was a voice from the past, a record, and it was named Elsie. What she said was simple yet burning, a mix of purpose, anxiety, and remembrance. She described the everyday abuses, the kidnappings, and the unsaid fear that pervaded every nook and cranny of the quarters. She described the secret staircase that went to the room where the 7 had been buried and the tunnel beneath the house. As if speaking their names could bring them back, even in recollection, she named each kid individually. Ruthie, Sam, Jonah, Sila, Matthew, Anth, and Paul. She explained the plan she had in mind, silent and exact, and the night she vanished, her corpse vanishing into the darkness as the plantation slept. She just stated that her vengeance had been exacted and that the guys who had committed horrific atrocities would never again injure a human being without describing how she had done it. The diary's words were calm and calculated, yet beneath them throbbed the inexplicable passion of someone who had endured pain and refused to stay helpless. Elsie's belongings was a monument to tenacity and inventiveness, as well as a history of injustice. She wrote about the world she had lived in, the kids she had loved while she was away, and the decision she had taken to turn dread into action. She carefully mapped out what had been and what she had changed with every word she wrote. She concluded by writing, "If justice is denied in the flesh, let it rise in the earth. If the living cannot see me, let the earth carry my voice." People who read the fragment later felt more than just its literal meaning. There was a presence in the words, a trace of someone who had risen above the boundaries placed upon her. Later, locals would talk about a woman in a red headscarf who would appear among the fields on stormy nights, moving silently and bending low as if listening to the soil itself. Some said they could feel her gaze even if they couldn't see her. Others swore the wind whispered her name. Elsie had vanished from the world, but through her words and the legacy she left under the soil, she preserved a truth that official histories could not touch. The story of suffering turned into agency, of fear turned into quiet, unchangeable justice. The cloth's discovery did not solve the mysteries of Black Hollow. No burial records matched the 7 children, and no other evidence explained the events she had documented. There was still a question that would haunt generations to come. What does it mean when the earth itself keeps score? What happens when those who have been wronged decide to speak through shadow instead of voice? The land itself seemed to remember her. The tunnel, though it had collapsed, continued to hum with the weight of the past, a silent archive of grief and retribution. Elsie's journey ultimately continued. Propelled by the sound of cotton in the breeze, the weight of roots in dirt, and the lasting impression of a woman who would not be overlooked.